Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's fantastic that you are already in a discussion, but we should leave a little bit of it for later. Dear Professor Dr. Barz, he has just arrived. Dear Professor Dr. Udo Steinbach, dear Professor Dr. Jon Pahl, dear John, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. Fethullah Gülen, a life of Hizmet. That is the name of Dr. Jon Pahl's biography that we are going to get to know in more detail today. On behalf of the Foundation of Dialog and Education, the Forum Dialog and the Association for Social Engagement, I would like to welcome you to this lecture today. The great Greek historian Plutarch said once, life of a human being is like a book that needs to be read to understand it. In his biographies, he tried to act like a painter of portraits, showing pictures of life in order to encourage his readers to emulate great personalities and take them as a reference. With great instinct, Plutarch shows the greatness of his personalities of 48 biographies on the basis of small anecdotes and great deeds. His works show how difficult it is to write biographies because it is a complex task that requires capacities of a writer as well as capacities of a historian. Biographies demand comprehensive research and analysis in order to show a precise representation of the life of a person. In addition, biographers need to keep a critical distance and a balanced view on the life of the person concerned. All this is delivered by Dr. Jon Pahl in his biography. The reader receives a clear portrait of Gülen's vision. Pahl makes a substantial and significant contribution to the literature around Fethullah Gülen. But this has definitely been not an easy task. Because Gülen's life is a life of dichotomies, a life between Korochuk, the little village in southeast Anatolia where he was born, and the US federal state Pennsylvania, a life between East and West, between tradition and modernity, between preaching and practice, between reverence and contempt, between truth and often reproach as well, between threats and security. Navid Kermani once said, biographies can show us that life is full of contradictions and abysses, but that there's still always a way to continue. So, who wants to get to know Gülen's vision and especially his hope should definitely read this biography. It is a great pleasure for me to have this discussion here today with Dr. Jon Pahl, Professor Dr. Udo Steinbach and Professor Dr. Heiner Barz about this fantastic biography. Before I'm going to pass on the mic to Professor Barz, I would like to introduce him. Professor Dr. Heiner Barz is the head of the Department of Educational Research at the Social Science Institute of Düsseldorf University. His empiric studies about youth and religion evoked great interest, which was promoted by the Foundation Mercator and the Vodafone Foundation. He is also a member of the Scientific Council of the renowned Science Institute. In the past, he has intensively dedicated his view to Fethullah Gülen and his teaching and the schools created on his initiative. I would like to wish all of us an intensive discussion and a lot of new insights in this topic. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you at this activity, and I think this mic works, doesn't it? Okay. This might work better. So I'm very glad about the invitation to be able to discuss together with you tonight. I'm looking forward to how Dr. Pahl is going to present us his great biography of Fethullah Gülen. But I would like to make some comments from my perspective. I myself have encountered the Hizmet movement for the first time 10 years ago, and at that time I noticed that they created schools. I'm an educational researcher, so I'm always interested in getting to know innovative school models, new school models that have not existed in this way. And when I saw that for the first time, I thought, wow, that's interesting. So I went to see some schools with my students. I was a guest at some of these schools, and I actually had the chance to look into one of those schools in more detail. And I also carried out interviews with parents, students, and former pupils. Tonight, we won't speak mainly about Gülen, but about the biography of Fethullah Gülen. Therefore, I will just leave this topic. I just want to explain how I came to that topic. As it was mentioned some years ago, I also made a study about youth and religion in Germany, an empiric study. So I'm familiar with religious questions and religious sociology. At that time, it was very interesting to me to have this approach of Charles Glock, an American religious sociologist who found 5 dimensions of religiosity. And I want to briefly mention them. He differentiated between the dimension of belief, credo, then the dimension of the rituals. How do they practice their religion via prayer, lectures, or other common or individual activities? And that is secondly the dimension of rituals. And third, the dimension of knowledge. What do people know about their religion, their foundation, their teachings, their founders, and the history of religion? That is the dimension of knowledge. Belief, ritual, and knowledge. And that is what in the religious sociological research you find as a question asked to people. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus Christ? This or that? These are the typical questions asked. Do you go to church or the mosque or a Friday prayer? These are the typical questions in sociological religious studies. And there are 2 other dimensions by Charles Glock, and they are not seen, but they are still very important, especially in the context of our discussion today. Charles Glock found more dimensions. That is the dimension of religious experience. Religious experience, meaning what inner experiences are there that link a person to this religion and makes them practice it? What are the inner feelings, individual, group feelings, or in nature? And this is an element that I think in Fethullah Gülen also plays an important role. I think there is a chapter about the crying imam, and that dimension plays an important role, this dimension of religious experience. And the 5th dimension, which was put up, which also plays a role in Fethullah Gülen and those who are inspired by him, is the dimension of social consequences. What are the conclusions that I draw from my religious belief and conviction in my everyday life, in the way how I treat other people, how I am committed in society, starting with the family, education, up to commitment in society or political commitment. So this is a dimension of social consequences, which is also very important in the classical sociology, is a little bit left out. So all the more I'm happy that we will also have a look at this dimension tonight.
So let me make a second anticipatory remark on the situation in Germany. Well, having started 12 or 13 years ago, I soon came to realize that the German reporting on this man is a very polarizing one, even intrinsic with resentment and even animosities. Why is it that the German society reacts, well, let me put it like this, with a very hostile or even delicate approach? We have a competition. We have a Lutheran central authority for religious questions, Zentralstelle für Weltanschauungsfragen, a central office for questions of ideologies. I would say anything that is beyond its own religious sphere is taken with a grain of criticism, at times even with defamatory undertones, which has been the case also with the Hizmet movement. A second competitor, especially over the last 10 to 20 years, a sort of absolutism of science, the religion of science. You say science, and science is always right. Who is outside of science, or whoever claims to have a different understanding of the world than the one preached by science, faces hard times. So we see an outcasting or a marginalization of anything to do with religion. This regards not only Muslims, but also the old Catholics or anthroposophists or the free evangelical churches, the non-denominational Christian churches. They have rough winds blowing against them. Anything that cannot be broken down into the molecular level, anything non-scientific is seen as highly problematic. Moreover, in Germany, we are witnessing, well, if we come to talk about the educational efforts, which is a core element of the Hizmet movement, anything outside the government supervised school system, be it Waldorf schools or any, well, let me say, kindergartens in the wood or nursery schools placed outside the official educational system, is seen with a critical eye. They are taken as something totally outdated or elitist. So it's a problem that is also faced by the schools run by the Hizmet movement in Germany. Finally, a quick reminder that might highlight the difficulties of the reception of the Hizmet movement. We have a very mixed picture in the Turkish society. Well, there are several rifts inherent to the Turkish society. To understand these rifts inside the Turkish society is very difficult. You think you know Turkey if you know just one Turkish person, but everything you know is probably just one Kemalist individual, or you know a follower of the AKP party, and to disregard these highly nuanced and also highly heterogeneous other elements in Turkish society. Moreover, in German society, we can also see that fake news are passed on. For example, Professor Christoph Ultmann has written a whole book, cleverly faked, and he proved that Der Spiegel, the leading weekly magazine in Germany, well, he proved that a certain interpretation, a certain worldview, and even wrong views of the reported facts are propagated. Therefore, the press is not always living up to the pretended claim of objectivity. So it's difficult to get by objective reporting of those people that somehow refer to Fethullah Gülen and his work, his intentions, and his proposals. Now, the parallels that I can perceive between the global Hizmet movement, because it has reached a global level across all countries and continents, and another movement, the Waldorf movement, not the Montessori, that similar to the Hizmet movement, runs more than 1,000 schools all over the planet. And they have also universities, institutions of higher education. They also go back to the teachings of one person, Rudolf Steiner, Maria Montessori, Fethullah Gülen. Well, there are certain parallel strands. Well, I need to come to a conclusion with my preface. And I need to zoom in on the proper. Mr. Steinbach, you are going to the next one to see Professor Udo Steinbach. I'm happy to announce that you are going to deliver a keynote. Professor Udo Steinbach, you are somewhat my junior, but I have known you ever since he's the big Islam scholar. For decades, he was the head of the Islam Institute in Hamburg. He was one of the leading experts when it came to discussions about Islam or Islamic countries. His name has been a household name for many decades, so I'm all the more happy to greet him here. For long years, he has been director, or he was acting director of the Orient Institute. He sits on the board of 17 other institutions, scientific institutes, the MENA Study Center, MENA, Middle East and Northern African, MENA Studies. Then he's also sitting on the board of the Mäzenata Studienstiftung, Professor Dr. Udo Steinbach, and I'm privileged to welcome you. You are one of the most debated and at times even hotly debated scholars of Islam. Thank you very much for this overwhelmingly kind introduction. So it will be my task to give you a keynote address in just a few minutes, attempting to present Fethullah Gülen. Who is he, and how can you understand this man? And what about his future? What is my assessment of both his personal future and the future of the movement? Last Thursday, at the Wissenschaftskolleg, there was an evening staged on the topic of what is the role played by belief in theology today. In the invitation, it was stated, religious belief has lost its appeal or plausibility to so many people. Religious claims for truth are not to be taken for granted. Another quote from the introduction, if the reference to is the reference to God still a constitutive element of theology. So you may talk about God, you may reflect on God without believing in God. This evening, things are totally different. Tonight, we are going to become acquainted with a man who claims about himself, or about who we can say, you cannot act without keeping an eye on the divine, or keeping it in your heart, or you cannot believe in God without making him visible in society. Fethullah Gülen is not a theologian. His training and both his general school career, his theological training, is rather rudimentary. He is what one might call a preacher. A preacher. Preachers existed at all times in all cultures. Preachers do not argue rationally. Preachers have a message to preach. Preachers have a vocation. All this is true also for Fethullah Gülen. How can we localize Fethullah Gülen? We do not want to talk about preachers or prophets in general. How can we understand him? And what is his historic background? Of course, the historic time is such that he will continue to leave a mark as he did in the past decades. I understand Fethullah Gülen from two vantage points. First, the decline of the Ottoman Empire and its end. And the second vantage point is the establishment of the Turkish Republic as a secular state. On the one hand, the demise of the Ottoman Empire. The Islamic world was the loser, the Europeans were the winners. In the end, there was no longer the Ottoman Empire, and in the West, there was the prevailing view that Islam was an outdated religion. One of these North Stars, this shameful end of an Islamic order. And the second element is the founding of the secular republic. Secularism, religion is totally excluded from society. Religion is not only excluded, religion or the system is hostile to religion. Religion is taken away from society. The believer, not only in Anatoly, but also in other places. We are talking about Anatoly. So, the believer was in utter despair. What should he believe in? He had not lost his belief, but his belief was no longer appreciated. In the big cities, the powers to be were others that paid little attention to religious belief. It is in this environment that the preacher springs forth, in an environment where the theological academies were closed. So the preacher fills an empty space. The question arose to the societies of Anatoly. We will come back. Not only societies in Anatoly. How could one keep Islam alive while at the same time trying to grasp the key to modernity? Because the Ottoman Empire was not only a failure due to its military inferiority, it could no longer keep up with a world dominated by European powers. And here the question arose, how can one do that? With force and revolution? No.
That is a good contribution, a good chapter in the book that we will hear about, how he also looks into matters and people who can today not be ideologues in the political Islam. It was not the political Islam that he was attracted to, it was something else. It was the service for the community. And that brings us to Hizmet. And if we look back, then we notice that some of the preachers in Turkey sensed that vacuum and they wanted to fill it. Sayyidunusid. Fethullah Gülen is not imaginable without Nasidanusi. But he was inspired and went his own way. Both Said Nursi and Fethullah Gülen have lots of things in common. They lived in very humble conditions in the eastern part of Turkey, not from Istanbul. One of them is even a Kurd. So they grew up in areas where religion is lived, where they do not only talk about it, where they practice it. So there were no theological disputes or professors who don't believe in God when they talk about God. It is, in the end, concrete action that they saw. And that is also expressed in this biography that we will look at. There are 4 or 5 things we will hear about, 5 key elements in the life of Fethullah Gülen. That is the integrity of participation in non-violent practices of Islam and principled pluralism, which also manifests in a commitment to dialogue. These are essential approaches in the activities of Hizmet, and engaged empathy, the will to work to overcome suffering in the world, a commitment to education, and in the end an organizational model of social enterprises. So our writer who summarized it as Islamic humanism. It's about the human being in a religious, in this case, Islamic dimension. At the end of the long way that Fethullah Gülen and Hizmet went, gets a global dimension. It goes beyond Turkey, Anatolia, it goes to Africa, Central Asia, Europe, as my predecessor just mentioned. So it is about education and equal participation at a global level, not only in one society. There's a global demand where, in the end, the living together of all people in peace in a developed order is based on, which is a new world order in a way. Because the crisis is not just the crisis of Anatolia, it is not a crisis of Turkey, it is a crisis of the whole world. But all this, and with this I come to the end, happens in the political space. In the space of the Kemalist Republic, much is spoken about it. Fethullah Gülen is a citizen of the Turkish Republic and had to deal with the Turkish authorities, often in conflict and from a critical standpoint. But it is also the political Islam, and in the end, of course, it happens in agreement or with a view to the new order of 2002 as it was initiated by the AKP. So he had to also deal with Erdogan. And that is a decisive situation. Erdogan and Fethullah Gülen both claimed legitimacy of their action based on Islam. On the one hand, preaching peace, creating education, and on the other, in the political space, for his political party. However, Fethullah Gülen preached that a resilient civil society without restricting religion and human rights is in line completely with authentic Islam. Humanism means participation and empathy with all human beings, independently of their race or belonging. So education is a linking element. A political leader like Recep Erdogan was very coherent in his way and in different ways by exploiting popular Islam for his benefit, and it is used for his authoritarian political ambitions and in manipulation and control of people in order to enrich himself and his fellows. We know the face that brought him into prison in 1996. And if we read it backwards, then we might understand it better, what he meant when he said the mosques are our military quarters, the minarets are our bayonets, and the believers are our soldiers. Has Hizmet failed? As a movement, yes. As a movement, under certain political general conditions, we see that these conditions have deteriorated in Turkey. In the world, new ideologies, new world powers want to shape the world, and probably they worsened in Europe as well. And our biographer, who will soon take the floor, confirms that. He said Hoca Efendi, before he dies, will not see Hizmet coming back to its full strength. In practice, maybe, yes, maybe we hear more about that, but as an idea, it's not the case. The idea is part of a whole for global justice, for the human being to survive. Be it climate change, that we can only solve together, or be it a catastrophe due to an earthquake, which can also only be tackled together. That is where a regime fails, that only comes with old slogans, preaching Islam and practicing corruption. In these catastrophes, solidarity and cooperation is needed based on a human dimension, be it religion or other spiritual phenomena or other sources. In this sense, the ideas remain, and the ethics focused on action stay alive. Promoted by Fethullah Gülen. Thank you very much. Wann habe ich angefangen? Ich weiß jetzt nicht genau. Dear colleague Steinbach, thank you very much for this opening perspective on the action and the personality and the work of Mr. Pahl with your keynote. Thank you very much for this. Later on, we will have most probably also a chance to discuss, but now it's my task to present Jon Pahl. Jon Pahl is professor for history of Christianity at the Lutheran Seminar in Gettysburg in Philadelphia. He is a historian who looks at religion and the history of Christianity especially. He is also a musician, I heard, with an interest. Did you bring along your instrument? And he has also worked as a public theologian, speaking in public about it, writing essays, articles for newspapers. And today we are really interested to hear what you would tell us about this wonderful biography of Fethullah Gülen. The floor is yours.
I thank you most kindly for the invitation to be with you tonight, and I thank you to all who participated in organizing this amazing book tour. I am truly grateful. My topic is the authentic Fethullah Gülen, how the Hizmet movement he inspired offers a hopeful alternative to religious nationalism and the backlash to globalization. My talk will take us through a brief attempt at levity and then raise a series of questions. Who is Fethullah Gülen? What is our context? Why did I write this book? I'll then outline the book for you, including reading from a section of each chapter. I hope by my conclusion, which will be the final pages of the biography, you will recognize the Hizmet movement, inspired by Fethullah Gülen, as a hopeful alternative to religious nationalism and the backlash to globalism. Sound good? Okay. An attempt at levity. St. Julian of Norwich, a 14th century anchorite nun, once said, "The way to fight evil isn't to cudgel the brain, but to lead a life of love and laughter." So we'll try to laugh, or at least smile a little bit, through three pretty bad jokes. First, a mommy joke, based on my family's immigration experience from Germany to America in steerage. Mami, ich will nicht in die Vereinigten Staaten. Sei ruhig und schwimm weiter. Okay, a little anyway. Sorry. She is. Second, a little Fritz joke. My father's nickname as a child was Fritz. His name was Fred. Lehrer, wo wurde der Friedensvertrag von 1555 unterschrieben? Unten rechts. Finally, a Black Sea joke. Was passiert mit einem roten Stein, der ins schwarze Meer fällt? Er wird nass. Okay. Getting serious. My mentor at the University of Chicago introduced me to his favorite poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, who will give us our starting point for this evening. I would like to beg you, as well as I can, to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and to try to love the questions themselves, as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday, far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. We'll begin then with some questions. There he is. Who is Fethullah Gülen? That question begins to get an answer if we simply study where he lived in Turkey during his years there. He was born in Korucuk, in a tiny and poor village near Erzurum, in Turkey's northeastern corner. He then served his first appointment as a preacher in Edirne, in the far northeast, Thrace. Mandatory military service took him to the capital of Ankara and elsewhere, and he then served mosques in Izmir, around the Aegean region, and in Istanbul for the remainder of his years as a preacher. Since 1999, as is well known, he has lived at the Golden Generation Retreat Center in Pennsylvania, where he continues to teach, preach, and write as his health permits. Fethullah was the second child of 8 of Ramiz and Rafia Gülen, who gave birth to him in 1938. By all accounts, including his own, the Gülens were a happy family. His father, Ramiz, was an imam. Rafia was a Quran teacher, including to her son, and also, at some risk, she taught the Quran to women in her community at a time when the government was closely monitoring all religious communication, as our keynoter communicated. Gülen went to public schools only through 2nd grade, after which he studied Sufism and Islamic theology in madrasas in and near Erzurum, preparing to follow in his father's footsteps and become a preacher. In 1958, at age 20, he realized that aim, being called to serve as a preacher in a tiny mosque in Edirne, a Greek-influenced city in the province of Thrace. Edirne had a reputation for being a secularist stronghold, and Gülen quickly discovered that he could not, quote, preach Erzurum in Edirne, as he put it. His service as a preacher was interrupted in 1961 by mandatory military service required of all Turkish young men. He served for 2 years, mostly as a radio operator, mostly in Ankara, while continuing to preach as a guest in various mosques. It was during his military service that he first ran into trouble with secular authorities, who were on edge following the 1960 military coup. Despite these difficulties, which led to a brief leave of absence for health reasons, the years were fruitful for him. At the recommendation of one of his commanders, Gülen began studying Western philosophy, science, literature, and music, expanding the range of his understanding beyond only Islamic sources. Immanuel Kant was a particular influence. Gülen completed his military service in 1963, and when he returned to his call in Edirne, he moved into increasingly important pulpits, drawing large crowds. This again drew the attention of the secular authorities, and in 1964 he was arrested and charged with undermining the secularism of the Turkish Republic. He endured a trial, but was found not guilty and released. He then served briefly in a mosque in Kirklareli, also in Thrace, before being appointed in 1966 as a Quran teacher and preacher at Kastana Pazara School and Mosque in Izmir. Yeah. It was in Izmir that something identifiable as the Hizmet community began to develop. Gülen was worried about the setting. Izmir was cosmopolitan and perhaps even more secular than Edirne. "I will drown there," said the young man from Korucuk. Instead, he flourished, meeting with Jewish and Christian leaders, building bridges with political figures, police, and business leaders. Those business leaders began raising funds on Gülen's council to open and eventually build dersanes, dormitories, for students coming to Izmir's many universities from the Anatolian countryside. The dersanes proved attractive to Muslim parents as a way to help their youth transition from rural to city living, and they soon multiplied all over Turkey. Gülen also began holding summer camps for youth, a popular practice in many contexts, but not typical in Turkey. His sermons, often for weeks at a time on a single theme, such as faith or fasting or women, for just a few examples, would be advertised in advance, and the mosque would be full to overflowing. Friends also began recording the sermons and circulating them widely. Such attention once again riled the secular authorities, and following the so-called coup by memorandum in 1971, Gülen was arrested and jailed for 6 months when he was released in a general amnesty. Following his release, Gülen began a kind of itinerancy that would mark the remainder of his years in Turkey. He took pulpits in Manisa and Bornova, Izmir suburbs, but also traveled all over the Aegean teaching, preaching, and organizing business leaders, a pattern that eventually became nationwide. In 1977, he made his first international trip to Germany, where he spoke with the growing Turkish communities in Berlin, Hamburg, Köln, and other venues. Following another military coup, following another military coup in 1980, Gülen was prohibited from preaching for 6 years and was under constant surveillance at his flat in Istanbul, where he had moved. He also, however, had made friends in high places, and so when a raid was coming, he could be warned and would escape down the back stairs to go to a safe house in Erzurum or Istanbul or Antalya. By trying to silence Gülen, the government ironically spread Hizmet. As he visited diverse cities, he shared the patterns of thought linking Orthodox Islam and progressive modernity. And people in these venues began multiple initiatives in education and business to generate wealth for social causes. It was during these years that the first schools in Yamanlar in Izmir and Fatih in Istanbul began, led by trustees and organized around foundations of volunteers responsible for their governance. The schools followed a secular curriculum, and they emphasized especially science and mathematics, areas where Gülen was convinced Muslims had fallen behind the rest of the world. In 1986, Gülen, once again, was allowed to take the pulpit, and he began a pattern of preaching usually twice a week, once in Istanbul and once in Izmir. He preached for over a year on the topic of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions. By then, Hizmet had begun tutoring centers to help students do well in the Turkish college entrance exam, which became a significant source of revenue for the movement. And schools continued to be built at a rapid pace, first in Turkey, then in the Turkic-speaking countries of the former Soviet Union, and by the 1990s all over the world, including every continent. At the same time, the range of social businesses begun by people inspired by Gülen multiplied to include every range of human enterprise, especially media, construction, IT, think tanks, and disaster relief. And Gülen intensified his outreach in interreligious dialogue, welcoming the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel to Istanbul, meeting regularly with Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew I, and eventually making a pilgrimage to Rome to meet with Pope Jon Pahl II. Yet another government crackdown, following the so-called postmodern coup in 1997, led to further scrutiny of Gülen and Hizmet, eventually resolving to much sound and fury, signifying nothing. By this time, Gülen was also experiencing health challenges, notably diabetes and heart disease. In 1999, he followed his cardiac surgeon to the United States, taking up residence at a former summer camp, now a retreat center, about 2 hours north of Philadelphia in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania. Hizmet continued to grow all over the globe and in Turkey down to 2013. In that year, a corruption inquiry cut very close to Prime Minister at the time, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, And at his directive, the inquiry was cut short, and Erdogan's government began to turn on Gülen and Hizmet, seeing them as a threat to Erdogan's increasingly authoritarian ambitions. Governmental repression of Hizmet grew through a series of incidents in 2014 and 15, finally culminating in a theatrical but bloody failed coup attempt on July 15, 2016, which unleashed an unprecedented purge of anyone even suspected or accused of being close to Gülen, who was now labeled a terrorist. Since 2016, Gülen and the Hizmet community have been traumatized, to be sure, but also show once again signs of resilience that mirror what happened after every previous government attempt to silence the movement. Gülen's own health is fragile, but he continues to teach students and welcome guests at the retreat center as his health permits. Now, that quick overview obviously raises as many questions as it answers. Why did the government hate him so? I believe to live into that question, we must take a big step back from the messiness of Turkish politics to understand global dynamics that have characterized the past century or so. Asking another question, what is our context? I am persuaded by an argument of the Harvard neuropsychiatrist Steven Pinker that we live, until recently at least, with the tragic war crimes by Russia in Ukraine, we live in the most peaceful era of human history ever. Life expectancies have risen, infant mortality rates dropped, extreme poverty has been reduced, and we live with creature comforts unimaginable to my German ancestors who emigrated to America from Prussia in the late 19th century. This long peace, see Immanuel Kant's 1793 essay on perpetual peace, this long peace follows from three developments that Pinker tracks. First, the emergence of stable nation states where people have a voice and where violence is checked by the rule of law. Second, globalized trade networks, because peoples who trade with each other tend not to go to war with each other, war being notoriously bad for trade, as we have experienced over the past year. And third, peace follows from the formation of and participation by peoples in international agencies and organizations such as the UN. Pinker, unfortunately, fails to see that by far the most durable and robust of our international organizations are not secular political organizations. In fact, the most durable and robust of our international organizations are our religious traditions. I'll return to that insight shortly. Simultaneously with the emergence of this long and global peace, however, is the emergence of what sociologist Mark Jorgensmeyer first identified as religious nationalism, or more recently as religious violence, in patterns cutting across nations and cultures. I believe we can most effectively understand this rise of religious nationalisms as backlash to pluralism and globalization, much as historian Tara Zara from Stanford documents occurred between World War I and II here in Europe in a book that I highly recommend. Our context then, grossly simplified, is of a dynamic and growing global network of cultural exchange, not only trade, and growing respect for pluralism, facilitated both by easy travel and by technologies such as the internet and social media. Converging majorities, and simultaneously a backlash against globalization and pluralism in the form of religious nationalisms, clashing minorities. I believe these religious nationalisms are based upon a big lie, or perhaps a big distortion. The idea that a single religious unanimity is necessary to undergird any society, an impossibility in any event. The historical forces that have led to the unprecedented persecution of Gülen and people of Hizmet in Turkey, in other words, are similar to forces shared in widely diverse settings around the globe, such as Israel, Russia, India, and the United States, for example. We have seen these patterns, this reliance upon the big lie before, as Orwell so accurately depicted, quote, "And if all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past," ran the party's slogan, "controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past," end quote. And precisely because these settings are so different, Turkey, Israel, Russia, India, the United States, and more, and yet find a common cause, I find reason for hope. We are dealing with cultural systems, and cultural systems can be changed, improved, advanced. They are humanly constructed. A change in one place can lead to changes in others. As Bishop Desmond Tutu once put it, when people decide they want to be free, nothing can stop them. And at the heart of change on behalf of freedom must be how our religious traditions interact. To paraphrase an insight from the late Swiss theologian Hans Kühn, if religion is part of the problem, it must be part of the solution. Or as he actually put it more elegantly than I, no peace among the nations without peace among the religions, no peace among the religions without dialogue among the religions. I believe the people committed to growing peace between our religious traditions constitutes the vast majority of believers around the globe. Those misusing religion for narrow, nationalist political purposes, so-called strong men, are a dwindling but fierce minority of people pulled to reaction and backlash. I'll return to this point in my conclusion. I wrote my biography of Fethullah Gülen then, first of all, to answer the question, how could a single individual both inspire a global movement and inspire such fierce hatred? I suppose as a Christian, I should not have been surprised by this conjunction of love and fear. Peace builders often find their ways strewn with obstacles, but I was. A growing part of my motivation then, aside from the obvious historical task of objectively uncovering evidence and narrating it as accurately and clearly as possible, an increasing part of my motivation became to counter the big lie that has tarred Gülen as a leader of a global terrorist organization, FETÖ. That lie was built on several others which had circulated for years, namely that Hizmet was part of a parallel deep state within Turkey, and that Hizmet was a cult. Neither is accurate, which is also true of the big lie that Gülen and Hizmet were responsible for the botched July 15 coup attempt. Were there Hizmet individuals who, following orders, participated in the coup attempt? No doubt. But to believe that Gülen and people of Hizmet would undermine 40 years of patient, müspet hareket, positive action by embracing violence simply makes no sense. And even more, it contradicts the evidence. the one man who did have at his fingertips the control of the military was not an elderly scholar in Pennsylvania with limited computer skills, but the man who is now president of the Republic, Erdogan. And again, the purge of Hizmet civil servants began well before July 15th in a series of human rights violations that accelerated rapidly the very day after it. Consequently, I have sought increasingly to be intentionally corrective, to counter the big lie, and to clarify that the authentic Fethullah Gülen is a man of peace. He is a teacher and scholar who has inspired the nonviolent Hizmet community of volunteers to work for what I call deep peace, which is at the core to foster trust. Fethullah Gülen's historical significance is that he taught people to trust themselves as Muslims active in civil society. That trust grew into a movement that became a threat to a politician's increasingly dictatorial ambitions. And that dictator has targeted the movement since 2013 by a concerted and very well-funded campaign of misinformation, slander, and violence, including firings, arrests, passport seizures, imprisonments, closing of military outlets, seizure of corporate and personal assets to the equivalent of billions of dollars, and other human rights violations. I have taken as my guide then the eighth commandment of the Christian tradition: do not bear false witness, and in particular its articulation by Martin Luther in his small catechism, which I memorized as a child and still try to live by as a scholar. We should fear and love God, that we may not deceitfully belie, betray, or slander, or defame our neighbor, but defend them, speak well of them, and put the best construction on everything, end quote. Let me assert also, however, that putting the best construction on everything in no way compromises my commitment to evaluating critically the evidence, all of the evidence about the life of Gülen and the Hizmet movement. I had no interest in writing a hagiography, and I believe I avoided that temptation. I'm a sympathetic outsider or a critical friend of the movement. What I mean then by asserting that Gülen and people of Hizmet promote deep peace can be clarified by what I call the peace-growing garden. Peace is simply the capacity of people to flourish. Peace is not a utopian dream, but peace is in fact the lived experience of people every day as they grow as human beings, more or less. Religions especially contribute to peace organically more than strategically. But peace can also be differentiated. I call basic peace the absence of war or other arbitrary violence. It is often called negative peace in peace studies because the absence of arbitrary violence under the rule of law is the most basic requirement for human flourishing, for having a voice and agency in how one lives. Policy peace, then, is generated through political and economic relations and is marked by the absence of gross inequality and by fair access to resources such as food, water, shelter, energy, healthcare, education, all those resources that promote sustainability and flourishing. In a word, policy peace is justice, realized again, more or less, in any society. Finally, deep peace is trust. And deep peace is generated through literacy, through nonviolent practices such as prayer, through engaged empathy, through principled pluralism, and social enterprises. I'll say more about each of these 5 topics as they are the topics of the 5 chapters in the biography. In other words, I organized the biography both chronologically and topically, tracing the course of Gülen's life and tracing how he is a man of peace by advocating for literacy, nonviolent practices, engaged empathy, principled pluralism, and social enterprises. And the irony of history is that it's exactly because Gülen and the movement trusted what Erdogan said when he came to power that has now made Hizmet a useful scapegoat for the dictator. Erdogan promised to advance egalitarianism in Turkey. He's proved instead to be a kleptocrat in the Putin model. Erdogan promised to advance Turkey's candidacy for EU membership. He's proved to be a religious nationalist. Erdogan promised to promote democracy in Turkey. He's proved to be a dictator by shutting down media outlets and stifling civil society. Erdogan knew Hizmet would not hit back, so he hit them. In a phrase repeatedly offered by Gülen to his friends, even in these exceptionally difficult times, quote, "We must be as handless to those who hit us, tongueless to those who curse us, forgiving everything that is forgivable. If they fracture us into pieces, still we are going to remain unbroken and embrace everyone with love and compassion. And with love toward one another, we will walk toward tomorrow," end quote. For the remainder of my talk, prior to taking your questions, and I look forward to them very much, I'll walk you through the 5 chapters of the book, reading brief excerpts to build my case that the authentic Fethullah Gülen is a man of peace. Chapter 1, then, learning, covers his upbringing in the Erzurum region, his first call to Edirne, and then traces the significance of the educational initiative started by Hizmet around the globe, focusing especially on schools in Iraq and the Kurdish regions of southern Turkey. A central metaphor can characterize the educational initiatives of Gülen and Hizmet, drawing from the teachings of Said Nursi, whose Risale Nur he encountered in the early 1950s. Gülen has encouraged people to fly with 2 wings. That is, to learn to unite science and spirituality. Reflecting on his own education in the madrasa, Gülen wrote that, quote, "I early noticed that the madrasa did not have a modern line of rationale, a mathematical foundation, or at least a root in Baconian logic," end quote. The result was that the madrasa, quote, "estranged the natural sciences and research, despite injunctions in the Quran and Sunnah. While God says, we will show them our manifest signs in the horizons of the universe and within our own selves, we hardly saw research, examinations, and engagement with the nature of things. Although the Quran was read, the book of nature was left to the side. A clash emerged in the society, and the mind was separated from the heart," end quote. So uniting mind and heart, science and spirituality, is what it means to fly with 2 wings. And this drive for unity across disciplines is at the heart of Hizmet's educational enterprises. A school is a kind of sacred place, Gülen has said. And the movement, of course, has built thousands of tutoring centers, dormitories, primary and secondary schools, colleges and universities on every continent. People of Hizmet have attended, and some now teach at, the world's most prestigious universities. Through education, Gülen and people of Hizmet have fostered the literacy that grows trust, that grows deep peace. Chapter 2, We Were Young, traces Gülen's years in Izmir at Kastanapazara School and Mosque, which is where the Hizmet movement really took root. The chapter is structured around the 5 pillars of Islam: confession, prayer, pilgrimage, fasting, and charity, and traces Gülen's teaching on each of these 5 topics, while also tracking his growth and development. What began to emerge as he built relations with business and public leaders in Izmir was what we can call civil Islam, as opposed to political Islam. If political Islam seeks to use political party organizing to foster Islamic societies from the top down, civil Islam seeks to form faithful Muslim individuals who then contribute to civil society through their diverse vocations from the bottom up. That is, Gülen saw the formation of individuals through nonviolent practices like prayer as the crucial first step toward peace in a Turkey that was terribly divided by political factions. Working especially with youth, Gülen brought back from his first pilgrimage to Mecca the conviction that as a Muslim, he was a citizen of the world. He was above all a servant of God. And that meant, as he once put it, that to go from one place where there is Hizmet to a place where there is no Hizmet, to create Hizmet, is to do pilgrimage. End quote. Pilgrimage, then, was not just tied to a specific place. It was what one did with the pilgrimage that mattered. Gülen had noted that many young men didn't go to the mosques, but spent a lot of time in coffee houses playing cards and backgammon. Some things don't change. So he suggested to his friends that they go to coffee houses. One of these friends was Yusuf Pekmezci, who died in jail last year. Pekmezci recalled in an interview that he tried to dissuade Gülen. "That's a really bad idea," he remembered saying. "People smoke there, they play cards. People will ask, 'What's a Hoja doing in a coffee house?'" Gülen acknowledged the concerns, but then said, "You're worried about what people will think. My concern is what God thinks. The prophets went to the people. The people didn't listen. They derided them. They did bad things to them, but no prophet gave up on going to them. We need to give our respect to these people because they too are created by God. Nobody is greater than another. What we know, we must share. If they ask, and we know, we'll explain, and we might have things to learn from them." End quote. So they went to the coffee house. And eventually these meetings spread to dozens of coffee houses in Izmir and the Aegean. A pilgrimage to Mecca became a repeated pilgrimage to take Hizmet where there is no Hizmet. That was only one of the nonviolent practices that Gülen began reviving and reinterpreting during his years in Izmir. Collectively, the spiritual practices at the heart of Islam generate deep peace, as they did for people inspired by Gülen as they prayed, fasted, gave charity, went on pilgrimage, and trusted in God and in one another. Chapter 3, Empathy and Tears, 1971 to 1980, documents the rapid growth of Hizmet as Gülen's fame as a creative teacher and powerful preacher grew throughout Turkey, and especially in the Aegean region. His preaching was marked by both scholarly precision and intense emotion. He would often cry, as our keynoter said during a sermon, and frequently the entire congregation would start crying with him. He became known, in fact, as the crying Hoja. At first, this struck me as very odd, perhaps even manipulative. But Ezra Koshar offered me in an interview one of the best explanations. She grew up in Ankara and learned of Gülen through audio tapes of his sermons that he delivered in mosques around the Aegean. "I was wondering," she asked, "why was he crying?" Over the years, Koshar worked it out. Quote, "Eventually it became easy for me to understand. He was crying over the situation of Islam in the world. We are behind in every subject. As humans, we are failing God by not being servants of God." End quote. Hoja Efendi's tears signal a deficit in Hizmet. To further explain, Koshar recalled a teacher she knew in Ankara. This teacher, quote, "was filled with hatred. Unlike her," she continued, "Hoja Efendi was not angry, but his sermons were filled with compassion and love." End quote. Her evidence to support this assertion was that Gülen's tears stemmed from and encouraged self-critical awareness. Quote, "Look at ourselves," she paraphrased Gülen. "And rather than being angry with people around us, rather than blaming others, look at ourselves. Why are we here? end quote. That positive approach, living the questions, as Rilke put it, gave Koshar hope to live a life of purpose through Hizmet. Gülen's tears were poetry without words, as he himself put it. In 1997, Gülen made his, In 1997, Gülen made his first trip to Europe, to Germany. He preached on the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, here in Berlin on December 9th, and on moral accountability in the same city on December 10th. He then traveled to Bremen, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Cologne, München, where he preached on or gave sohbets, conversations. At each site, he interacted with people who had been inspired by him, and with some who were simply curious about the Turkish celebrity who was in town. Gülen flew back to Izmir on December 16th. This was earlier than his original itinerary had anticipated. The trip did not go as expected. Some Turks connected to political Islamic currents in Turkey raised objections to Gülen's presence in Germany, and Gülen did not relish confrontation. The preacher from Erzurum was also homesick. As he put it, I had never been apart from Turkey and my friends for so long. Despite having been homesick, Gülen had enjoyed his tour to Germany, and it bore fruit with long-ranging significance for the Hizmet movement. Although there was friction, there were also ready audiences in nearly every city for his orthodox yet modern Islam, a hybrid that matched the experience of many Turks who had migrated to Germany since the 1960s, some in the audience tonight. Word of the crying Hoja had circulated among these Turkish expats, so Gülen had been welcomed with crowds, if not with friends, wherever he spoke. He encouraged these Turks to take a middle way, to integrate into German society, and to practice their Islam robustly and peacefully. Reflecting in later years on the opportunities he had to travel abroad, several more trips were coming in the 1980s and 90s, including a definitive one to the US in 99. Gülen observed that, quote, "By visiting the States and many European countries, I realized the virtues of and the role of religion in these societies. Islam flourishes in America and in Europe better than in many Muslim countries. This means freedom and the rule of law are necessary for personal Islam. Moreover, Islam does not need the state to survive, but rather needs educated and financially rich communities to flourish. In a way, not the state, but rather community is needed for a fully democratic system," end quote. What I call engaged empathy was how Fethullah Gülen took his awareness of suffering, of the way Muslims had fallen behind, and translated that into practical action as servants of God to alleviate suffering insofar as possible. Following again Said Nursi, Gülen posited 3 causes of suffering as the most severe problems in the world: ignorance, poverty, or disunity and violence. Within the next decade, people inspired by Gülen would build schools to end ignorance, generate wealth through countless social businesses to end poverty, and sponsor interreligious dialogues to overcome disunity and violence. 2 more chapters. Still with me? Okay, thanks. Chapter 4 then concentrates especially on dialogue, for which Gülen and Hizmet became well known. One of the residences that Gülen lived in for 6 years when he was prohibited from preaching, known to close associates and friends, was a small apartment in a modest concrete flat in the Altunizade neighborhood of the Üsküdar district on the Asian side of Istanbul. And that's about as many Turkish cities as I could string together in one sentence. It was a Hizmet dormitory built with rooms for teaching along with rooms for students. Gülen's room was on the 5th floor. And that designation, the 5th floor, soon became a metaphor for how in Gülen's life and work, the melancholy of Istanbul, described so beautifully by Orhan Pamuk, the melancholy of Istanbul turned into both a deep personal peace and an expanding network of people that came to be called throughout Turkey, in fact, the Cemaat, the community. That community was dedicated to literacy, to nonviolence, and to engaged empathy. But during Gülen's years in Istanbul, he also became known for his commitment to interfaith dialogue and to a Turkish word often found in his preaching and teaching that has generally been translated as tolerance, but that really means more than that tepid term can convey. That word is hoşgörü. My understanding of hoşgörü is something like principled pluralism. A person committed to hoşgörü lives with integrity in one's own tradition, hence principled, but also lets others live out their deepest commitments that might differ dramatically from one's own, hence pluralism. But principled pluralism, or hoşgörü, as practiced and preached by Gülen and lived out in Hizmet, was not mere relativism. Instead, principled pluralism of hoşgörü in Hizmet wagered that Islam provided a foundation from which differences could be engaged and turned to cooperation through dialogue. A quote that Gülen often cites from Said Nursi, again, makes the point, quote, "Victory among civilized persons is won through persuasion," end quote. That is, when people of Hizmet met across differences, they did so on a basis of mutual respect. Knowing where one stood as a Muslim made it possible to accept differences without judgment, and surely without violence. Differences then created conditions for dialogue, and dialogue helped people learn to live together with greater peace and justice than before. That's an academic definition of hoşgörü then, as principled pluralism. But hoşgörü also meant, as Dr. Scott Alexander taught me, theologically, to see another as God sees them. And God sees above all with eyes of mercy and compassion. It was with this God's eye aspect of hoşgörü, as articulated by Fethullah Gülen, that led so many people of Hizmet in the 1990s to invite people from diverse cultures and communities into their community. During his years in Istanbul, then, Fethullah Gülen turned the melancholy of hüzün into hoşgörü through Hizmet. Large public dialogue events became signatures of the Gülen community, with Gülen often as keynote speaker or increasingly as honorary chair. These events, sometimes sponsored by the think tank Journalists and Writers Foundation, drew cross currents of Istanbul's business, artistic, and political elite to places like the posh Renaissance Polat Hotel, where on November 11, 1995, more than 1,000 gathered for an iftar dinner where Gülen spoke on, you guessed it, hoşgörü. These events continue now all over the world. It was an iftar dinner in Philadelphia in 2006 that first brought me into contact with the movement. Chapter 5, then, the final chapter, Hizmet Global, America, 1990 to the present, documents both the continued growth of Hizmet to every continent and the emergence of troubles between Hizmet and the Turkish government beginning in 2013. I've already said enough about the latter, so in my remaining marks I'll concentrate on what I call in the book the DNA of Hizmet. Gülen's teaching regarding istişare, mutual consultation. From the very beginning of his teaching, Gülen taught that every person has dignity and voice. Nobody is intrinsically better than any other. This teaching became the heart of a deliberative style of organizing where people learned to trust themselves and each other. Gülen describes istişare as follows, quote, "For the Muslims of today, consultation is a vital attribute and an essential rule, just as it was for the first Muslims. According to the Quran, istişare is the clearest sign of a believing community. The importance of consultation is mentioned in the Quran to the same degree as salat, prescribed prayers," end quote. Given this importance, quote, "the most intelligent person is the one who most makes use of consultation and deliberation and who benefits most from the ideas of others," end quote. Finally, then, in consultation, quote, neither seniority, nor title, nor status, nor being a personage of esteem can be a factor for making another person's opinion more credible. On the contrary, when the truth has become manifest in any consultation, giving weight to these other factors can destroy the spirit of the consultation, end quote. Hizmet grew because consultation discovered differences, promoted debate, and taught people to trust themselves and others. People inspired by Gülen learned by making mistakes, adjusting accordingly, and trying again. That resilience has been the key to surviving the many efforts made first by secular authorities and now by political Islamists like the Turkish dictator to undermine Hizmet's efforts in education, social business, and dialogue. And so I conclude the biography of this remarkable man and the movement he inspired as follows. Finding hope in the midst of trouble had been a regular, almost routine part of Fethullah Gülen's biography, and by now there were islands of peace, as he called them, on every continent. Those peace islands were the schools, dialogue centers, and social enterprises wherever they operated. And those peace islands were countries where new friends could be made and where Muslims could practice their faith without oppression. For if an old man might be tempted during a cold winter in exile to despair of ever again seeing those green spring days, in fact, as Gülen wrote, eyes on a very long horizon and tied to no specific nation. I'm now quoting him. Our old world will experience an amazing springtime before its demise. The springtime will see the gap between rich and poor narrow. The world's riches will be distributed more justly according to work, capital, and needs. There will be no discrimination based on race, color, language, or worldview, and basic human rights and freedoms will be protected. Individuals will come to the fore, and learning how to realize their potential will ascend on the way to becoming the most elevated human on the wings of love, knowledge, and belief. Yes, this springtime will be a time in which humanity will discover its real essence. Goodness and kindness, righteousness and virtue will form the basic essence of the world. No matter what happens, the world will come to this path sooner or later. Nobody can prevent this. We pray and beg that the infinitely compassionate one will not let our hopes and expectations come to nothing. End quote. In a winter of brutal strong men, such hopes for a glorious spring seemed utopian. Nothing more than a prayer. Yet if there was one thing Fethullah Gülen really knew how to do, it was to pray. So when he also encouraged people that difficulties increase in accordance with the greatness of the consequent reward, that too was a prayer. But it was also a maxim that had been proved in Fethullah Gülen's life, almost from its beginning. To some, the oppression in Turkey signaled the death of Gülen's dream for a golden generation. And there was surely a death looming. The boy from Korucuk was now a frail, old man. And yet Fethullah Gülen's life was never about a short-term horizon to be measured by the brief span of 80 years and 10. He believed in heaven, he believed in resurrection, he believed in justice. His horizon was eternal. And so the end of Fethullah Gülen's life, whenever it would happen, would hardly be the end of Hizmet. Eternal truth could not be contained by an authoritarian's ambitions. Fethullah Gülen had lived for a peace that surpassed understanding because it was a peace that surpassed the superficial limits of time and space. After all, even a Sufi in exile whirled in a light far more substantial than mere earthly matter, caught up in an energy that was present at the very beginning of creation and that would be there at the end of time. Thank you once again for the invitation to be with you. for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
So you showed the image of a preacher, but you're also not a bad preacher. And you showed Fethullah Gülen as an impressive personality, a person with worldwide influence, almost like a superhuman. Almost like a superhuman. So I was wondering, where are the human traits? I heard it once when he spoke about being homesick. So he was homesick being in Germany, and most probably in the US will also be a bit homesick because of Turkey. But if you could pick up this idea, personal impressions, where did you see Fethullah Gülen as a human being, not a superhuman, not representing virtues, compassion, and all these positive attitudes and characteristics that you could wish for? Where did you see Fethullah Gülen as a human being?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And I'll tell two stories or two aspects of his life that emphasizes his humanity. The first is related to his late sister, Nuriyat. I interviewed her in her apartment in an Izmir suburb, and I asked her about her relationship with her brother. She was older than him by a few years, and she said that they used to sing together. Okay. Yeah, so there was music in the household, and she said their voices actually meshed quite nicely together. But their younger brother, Fethullah, when he tried to sing along with them, it didn't sound so good. Okay. And she began singing. Okay. And she sang a song of the foods, it's called, which is just a childhood song about vegetables and fruit and meat and bread and all of the rest, you know. And as she was singing it, she began crying, and I felt at that time the family dynamic. And so when I interviewed Gülen, after I had a complete manuscript finished, I waited until I had a clear line. I asked him about this song, and he recited the words for me from his memory. So, he was raised in this kind of a family, a loving family that he remembered fondly and that he also struggled with as well. And the second is, there's been evolution in his thinking. Especially and importantly in this context in relationship to the Jewish community. Okay. He's been accused of anti-Semitism and has said he has learned from his dialogues with the Jewish community over the 1990s how to reinterpret some of the passages in the Quran that he believes have been misused and misunderstood to foster anti-Semitism. And of course, he has now become an ardent advocate against it. And I think that evolution shows him as a human being.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would now like to ask a question to Mr. Steinbach to what you described as general, global, and historical traditions. You described Fethullah Gülen as an Islamic humanist, if I understood you right. Yes, that is also in the biography. So an Islamic humanist, and humanism is a current that is not necessarily based on religion. The human being is in the center and human capacities should be developed. So religious issues might be part of it, but not necessarily. But you also described Fethullah Gülen as a preacher, and you said preachers do not argue. I thought that was a nice formulation. Preachers don't argue. They have a message. They have a mission, a vision and a mission. And humanism might be the other side, because humanism wants to educate people to understand, not via enthusiasm only, but to develop their own thinking. So this interaction between preaching and humanism is something I would like to discuss. And maybe another key point I would like to add is the Protestant working ethos, which I see also as a new form in Fethullah Gülen's action, which was described in Max Weber's ascesis, the servitude to God, and that the person leads the right life and is chosen by God, and that is being shown in their everyday life by doing the right things and by contributing with their creative power in their work. And this kind of tension and also seeing something Protestant in this Islamic form, I would like to know what is your view on that?
Then you would classify, he classified the entrepreneurs in Anatolia as Calvinists, Islamic Calvinists. I would do away with your net distinction between humanism and religious passion. Yes, we do have the Enlightenment in between, and it comes with a strong secular undertone. But here it is a claim to human essence, which comprises all forms of rationality and emotionality. So it claims to address human beings as a whole with the overarching objective to make coexistence together, explicitly not directed only at Muslims but at people of all faiths. This was the stand-alone characteristic. You went to Latin America, to Europe. So I think this was unique in the Hizmet movement. This is an extremely topical and very up-to-date claim. And he talks to the entire humanity, to all mankind. So it's a synthesis of humanism and being a pure human and religious belief on the other side, togetherness. Well, the liberation of Turkish citizens towards economic activities is in line. While the Kemalistic secular movement was concentrating on the big cities, while Anatolia, the peasant, or the small industrialist, or the small and medium enterprises over all the decades were invisible, or were not to be seen on the political scene, if only during the 70s with Necmettin Erbakan, who was one of the trailblazers for Erdogan. It was still the frightened Anatolian citizen who voted for an Islamist party and the military. You refer to this. Well, the military crushed and quashed this type of religious existence. That it was the cornerstone of the development of modern Turkey. After 2001, the Anatolian humans were taken out of the corners, of the shady corners, and they were put on an equal footing, while the Kemalist movement was always focusing on the big cities. So it was a liberation of the entire society, which also reflected in economic success. We see it again. Erdogan has contradicted his own philosophy by oppressing the Gülen movement. He quashed the entire movement, and the economic problems resulting for today's Turkey are also triggered by this, because this enormous progress were, so to speak, oppressed again. Were capsized upside down. You highlighted the standalone trait of this movement and the impulse given by Fethullah Gülen that was spread globally. Well, I have thought about this. Do we have similar movements, similar trends, or similar personalities, outstanding religious models in the West? That might have been probably Dalai Lama, funnily enough, who does not come from the West but enjoys huge esteem in the West. For some time it was also Khomeini. He, for a certain period of time, was an outstanding Islamic leader, not only in Iran and in Persia. I would be interested to learn from both of you. How would you see this parallel between various personalities? Or is it totally off the point? Is it a totally different chapter talking about Khomeini or Dalai Lama or Fethullah Gülen?
Well, the book I'm working on right now compares Fethullah Gülen to Gandhi, who is not a Western example, but has been influenced by Tolstoy and others, and has certainly been influential in the West. Gandhi and Lima Bowie, the Liberian Lutheran Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2011. So comparing those three, but I really will track through that trajectory from Gandhi to Gülen to Lima Bowie, the emergence of religious peace growing, I call it, in individuals such as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks in London, in movements like Religions for Peace, and in the ecumenical movement, the World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches, in statements like the Muslim document, A Common Word Between Us, the most broadly based Islamic statement ever. Muslim leaders from 38 different countries, you probably know this better than I, that said finally it comes down to two things. Christians and Muslims, between us, we make up more than half of the world's population. If we actually practice what we preach, imagine what the world would be like. And what do we preach? Okay, I'm going to preach a little bit here more, just not too much longer. Two things. One, love God. Two, love your neighbor. And there are, again, many similar movements that emerged over the course of the 20th century, and many significant individuals. The civil rights movement in the United States, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malala Yousafzai. I mean, they're just example after example that are comparable to Fethullah Gülen and his peace growing, as I see it.
Okay, you said love God, love your neighbor. I would add to it, love yourself.
Yeah.
And that's why I think in the Western countries, Dalai Lama is has such a big influence.
Yeah.
Because this is a topic which is very important and which is...
Yeah, that's
Herr
beautiful.
Steinbach, wollen Sie dazu was sagen?
Yes, I take pleasure in replying to this. The seduction by Fethullah Gülen was palpable. And it is also written in the book that you deal with political Islam, with the Muslim Brotherhood, and Khomeini. Khomeini is the counterfeit, by definition, the exact opposite to Gülen, politically and also militarily. And by the way, also Shiite. But this needs to be stated. I think you can forget about him. The political part, Khomeini with the revolution in Iran, based on a Shiite agenda that aims at power, and in the Sunni area, the Hakimiyya Allah, the sovereignty of God. These are opposed approaches, opposed to what Fethullah Gülen opted eventually for. You can forget it. The power of Khomeini, well, he became a politician from the scratch. He created his own enemies, and he also questioned his own revolutionary achievements. The Islamic State as the acme of, as the summit of the jihadism, of the political Islam, was doomed from the beginning. It was doomed from the beginning. It was up for failure. Well, Gandhi, well, he is the man who brought about the independence of India. Gandhi is a humanist, role model for so many, and similarly the Dalai Lama. But Gülen has another dimension. He has a global dimension to his deeds, and he talks to people on a practical level, creation of education and communality. This is different to what we associate with Dalai Lama or with Gandhi. Well, thank you very much for this insight. I would now ask Mr. Pahl, you state your book is a critical biography. Now, today, you uttered little criticism about this man. Could you please also tell us 2 or 3 critical elements or first glimpses of something that has not gone so well?
Yeah, the first critical thing that has evolved in Hizmet and continues to do so is the transparency. So because Mr. Gülen was under threat and was imprisoned repeatedly, he developed, and the movement developed habits of not being completely upfront about things. They had to, as we discovered. Even that did not protect them in Turkey from the closure of their businesses and seizure of assets and so forth. But that to me is one of the things that has been a problem. What is the hierarchy? Who are the abis and ablas who are responsible in the different regions, the brothers and sisters, and what is their relationship to each other, and how does that get negotiated? All of that is somewhat opaque still down to today, and that includes, his role as inspiration and in consultation with individuals. A second is the role of women. He has been consistently an advocate for full education for women and full participation by women in all aspects of civil society. The movement, however, reflects a deep patriarchy in Turkish culture, and that's true of many secularists as well in different forms in Turkey. And Gülen's own thinking has also evolved in some ways on that, but there are some blind spots still, I think, that I could point to. But again, that's not my task. It's a critical biography, reading the evidence, telling his life story, and somebody else has done a pretty good job of coming up with critiques, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Steinbach, any critical points or things where you might criticize the Hizmet movement, or could also release some recommendations for further development? Well, we have given them already. A gentleman is sitting in front of us who had a lengthy session with us to clarify this. What went wrong? Probably. I do not want to repeat everything that has been stated back then. The cardinal mistake was that he close ranks with Erdogan, because both were interested. And the biography highlights this beautifully, but it became very soon clear that they followed different objectives, different methods. Certain elements of the movement in Turkey or Turkey have been captured by Erdogan for too long a time. Zaman, this newspaper, supported for too long a time Erdogan. Much earlier should they have broken away, so they became caught up in a trap that was placed by Erdogan in December 2013. And also the military coup that was prepared to crush the movement altogether. That was the cardinal mistake, and this needs to be reckoned with. We are sitting here in Germany, we are talking about Hizmet. Well, for the foreseeable future, Hizmet would be well advised to constitute itself as a German or European association. This global approach that had been cherished for decades until 2013 or 2015, I think in the foreseeable future can no longer be pursued. Too many things have happened. Too many things need to be dealt with or need to be studied in Turkey itself. The Turkish ambassador joined our reunions. It was never about the internal conditions in Turkey. It was only about the Turkish-German relationships. In the end, things happened in Turkey that shifted the Gülen movement into this situation where it almost drowned in Turkey itself.
Thank you very much. So tonight we also want to give the public, the audience, the chance to ask questions to the two colleagues here and to me. So if that is the case, then we will give you the mic. But just one thing, we have looked into the past. We have to work out certain things. But looking into the future, Fethullah Gülen is almost a Superman, but he's not immortal. So the question is, what will happen with the movement once he will have died? Hopefully in 20, 30 years, but it could be in a shorter time. Are there any fears or new opportunities, or is it completely open? Mr. Pahl.
There are likely to emerge struggles. That's human,
Of course.
right? And the only honest answer a historian can give to a question about the future is, it depends. But I do think we see, what I see is resilience and increasing globalization, multi-centered. I don't think just Germany will be the center, or Great Britain, or America, or Australia, but I think there will be multiple centers, and I don't know what the structure will look like. I can't project.
And your expectations regarding the future? As I said, the movement will get established as a civil society movement, and independently from the leader, it will be able to survive. But these need to be forces that are generated in society, also in Germany, for example. But we can't really say that here at the front. The people who are involved have to decide it. Okay, so what are we going to do about the audience? I'm just going around. Where was the question?
There's a microphone.
You wanted to say something, the lady, and over here. Well, let's start here. Thank you very much. My name is Jochen Thies. Hello, Udo Steinbach. I want to pick up an idea that you mentioned and continue that idea. I share your analysis, but I want to add something more optimistic. Since the so-called military coup, the Gülen movement in Germany has managed to become a relief organization in Germany, and elites are leaving Turkey. That is a new phenomenon that the official opinion in the Federal Republic does not yet recognize it. We had a lot of years poverty coming from Turkey. Now we get the best of the guest, and that is tragic for that country. But for Germany, it is an incredible benefit which happens almost invisibly. And I'm not talking about dozens of people. We are talking about a number of maybe 10,000 people in the meantime. And the other idea that I have in connection with this horrible earthquake catastrophe in Turkey, where is the great national gesture of Germany vis-à-vis the country that we have entertained a friendship for hundreds of years? What I see is that the Turks still feel that old friendship. We should not forget, we were military allies. And in Turkey, they feel that much stronger. And also German Turks, the third, fourth generation that we have in the Federal Republic. And I see that we are willing to do big demonstrations, but where is this standing up, showing we stand on your side, we suffer together with you, and we come out together? Thank you very much, Mr. Thies. This was more a comment referring to areas that we have not yet discussed, but which are still very important. Okay, so I would then go on to the next person. Thank you. Well, basically, there is just a small question that I find more and more important when I was listening to you. First of all, to all three of you, thank you very much. That's the first thing I would like to say. And secondly, how did Fethullah Gülen speak about your book and the political statements? You spoke about backlash to globalization. And the anti-capitalist variation that you have mentioned was not sharp enough, in my view. Did he also add something with his civil society movement? And was he enthusiastic about the book? I could imagine that, but I would just like to know it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Herr Pahl, it's your turn.
For that question, first regarding the backlash to globalization, that is something new for tonight. This is the first time I have spoken.
Das ist das erste Mal, dass ich darüber gesprochen habe, über den globalen Kontext, in dem ich seine Arbeit auch verstehe. Würde darauf
he
nicht
would not respond
antworten.
to that, but
Yes,
yes,
hat
he
sehr
has said very nice
angenehme
things
Sachen über das Buch
about
mir
the
gegenüber
book,
geäußert. Und
for
da
which
bin
I'm
ich sehr
grateful.
dankbar.
I mean,
Man
you hope
hofft,
that when you
dass
tell someone's
man
life story, you
wenn
won't
man
screw it
eine
up.
Biografie eines Menschen, das
Right?
nicht alles
And
durcheinander
I
bringt.
learned how
Und
complex
man
any
muss natürlich
single
sehen, wie
human life
komplex
is.
jedes
And,
menschliche
to
Leben ist. Und
choose
dann wirklich
which
auszuwählen,
moments to
welche
highlight,
Momente man
was an
heraushebt, das
extraordinarily
ist ein
complex
schwieriger
process,
Prozess.
but also one that
Aber
brought me
es hat mir auch
great
sehr viel
joy.
Spaß gemacht.
And
Ich habe
you know, I
mit
did
ihm
not
nicht
speak with him until
gesprochen,
after I
bis
had a
ich dann
complete
tatsächlich das
manuscript
gesamte
done.
Manuskript
So I can
fertig
ask
hatte,
him
sodass
very
ich ganz
specific
spezifische Fragen
questions. And I was a little
stellen
worried.
konnte. Aber
What
natürlich
if,
habe ich
you know, he
mir
was not
Gedanken
at
gemacht,
all
was
like I
ist, wenn
thought
er was ganz
from the
anderes sagt, als
evidence,
das, was
but
ich hier
I'm
recherchiert
happy to
habe.
report that
Aber ich habe mich gefreut,
we
dass wir uns
found
tatsächlich
ourselves
dann auch in
in a
einer sehr
rich and good
reichhaltigen
conversation that
Gesprächsrunde
reinforced what I had found
gefunden habe,
in
die
the
auch bestätigt hat, dass
documentary
ich in den
evidence.
Dokumenten herausgefunden habe. Aber
Thank
vielen
you
Dank
for the
für die
question.
Frage. Das ist eine gute Frage.
It's a good one.
Thank you, Jon Pahl.
Danke, Jon Pahl. Wollten Sie noch was sagen? Danke für diese wunderbaren Abend. Ich möchte zwei Fragen stellen, eigentlich drei. Eine davon ist schon gefragt worden. Shall I speak German or English?
Okay, dann sprech lieber.
Okay, then I speak in German. I would have two more questions, Mr. Pahl. I had the honor to read the whole book and also to correct things. But yesterday only I met you personally. And I would have asked you, what was the challenging moment when you wrote this biography? Der herausfordernde herausfordernde Thema, als Sie diese Biografie schreiben. Das ist die erste Frage. Die zweite Frage, you have spoken about civil Islam. You have said that Erdogan and Gülen start from Islam, although they have completely different practices and teachings that they implement. Do you think that the concept of Gülen could be a hope for Muslim communities? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, Arhan. Nice to see you again. Regarding the first question, a difficult moment. I'm a historian, so I like to have some distance from the things I write about, decades, centuries even. And so writing about the most recent events in Turkey was extraordinarily difficult to navigate because I don't have access to the archives, I don't have access to the official documents, and the reporting was so different coming from Turkey. So finding my way through that political thicket was a real challenge for me. But when I feel good about where I landed with it. Granting that I am no expert on any of this, this is my layperson's historical perspective or approach. Regarding civil Islam, yes, of course I see this as hopeful. Again, I'm not a scholar of Islam, so I can't make the kind of comparisons that my colleague here could do, but it is my hope that the kind of teaching that Fethullah Gülen has offered and that the Hizmet movement represents is a leaven that can enhance all of Islam as it can throughout the globe. As the doctor said, whatever culture where people of Hizmet land now, they're getting the best of the best.
Thank you very much. So there's one comment or question, and I think that will be then the end. You might also want to ask a question, my neighbor. I will give you the floor afterwards. I want to introduce myself. I'm the director of a primary school. All the time we talked about a person who is an imam, a preacher, who dedicated his life to Islam. Could people one day that look how Muslims live, could these people possibly also be dangerous? Did you ever have that suspicion that these people could be dangerous?
Yeah. Of course, yeah. Okay. I mean, I was educated at the University of Chicago by people like Paul Ricoeur, where the hermeneutics of suspicion is in the water. So I'm always looking for, okay, where's the trouble? Where are the problems? What are the challenges and dangers? But I think it's pretty evident historically that the danger for me does not lie from people in Hizmet, right? I mean, the danger is for all of us, is from these religious nationalists, these people with authoritarian, dictatorial ambitions who misuse religion for political purposes. So I'm willing to take that risk, to trust, and while also maintaining my critical scrutiny of all evidence. But it's a good question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We just said another question, but now there's another question of this lady, so I will pass back the mic. I have a very short, but maybe not so easy question. Are there any possibilities to evaluate how broad the followers of the Gülen movement is outside Turkey? Is it a very small minority, or is it really a bigger number, a considerable bigger number? Thank you very much. I can't answer this question, honestly. I can do some guessing, Mr. Thies as well. You might do so as well, Mr. Steinbach as well. So, Mr. Thies, you start with his conclusions. Before the military coup, I think it was 180,000 in the Federal Republic of Germany. Thank you. Mr. Steinbach, do you also have a guess? I think it is also not necessary that we guess. The movement is at the beginning. We don't need to torture ourselves thinking how many live in Central Africa or in Africa. The movement has to refocus. And I would say, looking at history, movements are linked to a preacher and leave with a preacher. Some things remain. Literature, Neredusi passed it on to Fethullah Gülen. It remains literature. But the movement goes on. And I think in the case of Fethullah Gülen, it will be the case. At some point, he will pass on, but the spirit will remain vivid. Let's look at Turkey. Mr. Erdogan is not going to win the elections. AKP is not going to win the election. That doesn't mean that there is new space for Hizmet immediately. Not at all. Those who look at Turkey knows what Erdogan left behind. A completely polarized country in every sense. And if you listen to the Turkish population, how they perceive Hizmet broadly, it is a negative perception. And this alliance of six who want to take over after Erdogan, there are religious, extreme nationalists, social democrats, till they have come together and create a new order in Turkey. That will take decades, if they manage to do that at all. So we really stand at a new beginning. Thank you, Mr. Steinbach. Mr. Pahl, do you also want to give a guess or a prognosis? Nein. So with this, we come to the end. I would like to say thank you to all of you for following us in our discussion and the presentation. Thank you very much to both of my colleagues for this wonderful presentation and the interesting perspectives that you presented. I would like to say thank you to all the organizing team. It is represented by a woman, fortunately. 3 persons have already stood up. Thank you very much for organizing this evening, for inviting us today to Berlin. Thank you very much. I would also like to say thank you on behalf of the organizers, gerade Ihnen, Dr. Jon Pahl. Danke dafür, dass Sie hierher gekommen sind, Ihr Buch vorgestellt haben. Ich denke, wenn wir heute etwas mit nach Hause nehmen, dann ist es, dass wir unsere Hoffnung nicht verlieren dürfen und müssen. Alles wird gut werden. Ganz herzlichen Dank. Danke.
Auch Ihnen, Herr Professor Dr. Steinbach,
To you,
ein ganz herzliches Dankeschön.
Dr. Professor Steinbach, thank you very much.
Und Herr
Professor Barz,
trotz der Hindernisse auf dem Weg
despite
haben Sie es geschafft.
all
Vielen herzlichen Dank.
difficulties on your way to come here, you managed it. Thanks. Thank you to all of you for these wonderful and interesting insights. Have a nice evening.